Like to do in this video is pick my way through let's get it set up. I'd like to pick my way through the very first, let's get the exercise page up. I'd like to pick my way through the key concepts inside this particular group of exercises. Okay, the very first thing I'm going to do is copy and paste that class, and what I'd like to do is start with the concept inside this class. What's going on here in this particular, what's the purpose of this exercise? This will link very strongly to some of the work you're going to do in the after consolidation week. So it's very crucial that you spend a bit of time getting a sense of this. What you're going to find later is we will go back over it and hopefully strengthen it. Okay, so the idea is that there's some exercises which have arrays built out of that particular class and all these various links, and you have to output it and get some kind of output. Some of the output should be like this, but you might want to question it because there may be it may not output as you expect. So the purpose is to almost be scientific about how you're going to approach this particular exercise. But to be scientific, you need to pause first and ask, what's going on with this class? So let's just chat about it before we code. Okay, so we have a class here called node. Let's just shift this over a bit so you can see both side to side. Okay, so with the node class, what you'll notice, it has two member variables, an ID, right? So there's a node ID, and it also has something called a node private member variable. Do you see this here? Private node, linked node. Now, I'm just going to call this, actually I didn't want to write node because here I just want to write the name of it, okay? We're going to call it linked node. Then underneath that, you've got your constructor, you've got a couple of get sets and a get, right? So you've got a bunch of get sets in here, and then you've got a constructor as well, okay? But the interesting bit is this bit at the top. It's actually this line here. Here is a class, look at the situation. Here is a class called node, and there is a member variable inside this class of the same type. Now, for some of you, you might think that's a stunningly awkward and complicated idea, but it's actually a really clever idea. And this is a very, very specific type of relationship that we use with certain types of classes. Have a look at that, okay? And essentially what this does here is, what does it store, this memory variable? This member variable, sorry. What do you think it stores? Well, it's easier if I draw a diagram and it might make it clearer. So if we have a node and we created a node object from it, so let's do that, right? Let's create a node object and let's code and discuss what is going on in this particular class, because if you get your head around it, the exercises will be straightforward and your understanding hopefully will be clearer. So let's pop up. So what I've done is I've created a lecture week 3 project. I've created the node class. I've copied and pasted the code into there, as you can see under source. Then I've created an exercise class where I've got my public static main. And it's here I create my objects, okay? Now, if you're unsure about that, you need to really do a refresher back on some real basics, but we won't worry about that for the moment. So here, I'm going to create my object. So if you remember what I just said, here, the way to show you what's going on with this linked node is to create the object. Okay, so we're going to create a node object, and we're going to store it in a variable called n. Okay, so we're going to assign it to n. So let's do that in code. So to create it, we declare the type of object it is, the name of our variable, and we use the new keyword node, and we work out what we're going to pass it. So what do we pass it when we create a new node? Well, the way to answer that question is to go to the node class, and you can see that it has two pieces of information, an ID and a node. Right, okay. So let's click in there. Let's give it an ID of 0, and let's give it nothing. Let's give it a null for a node. So what I have here with n is a new node object that has an ID of 0 and it has null. So that means that when you look at the linked node member variable inside it, it's linking to nothing. It is null, right? So it's basically pointing, if you like, to an emptiness, to an empty space or an empty location. Not even an empty location, it just doesn't occupy anything, right? It's got null in there, nothing, nada, niente. I don't know why I'm even attempting to use different language. My pronunciation is so awful. So those who are Spanish or Italian and heard those two rather embarrassing pronunciations, I do apologize. Okay, so I've created an object, right? And the way to think of it is that inside is my link, but at the moment it's pointing to nothing. So actually it's like that. Okay, let's create a second node. Let's call it N1, right? Let's create a new object, same routine, make its member variable, the linked node, be null as well, right? First. And then we'll do a couple of really interesting things and you'll be able to test out what this concept does. So, okay, there's my first one, right? So let's do another one. And this one is not going to be N, it's going to be N1. I mean, you might want to call the first one N0. It's up to you. We want to change the ID. For simplicity, we'll call it 1. Okay, so now on screen, I have two nodes, N and N1. Now, this is where it really actually gets interesting. So these two, shift this over a bit, these two nodes are completely separated from each other. There's no connection between them whatsoever. But let's put a connection between them. Let's make N, this node here, connect to my second one. So here on my code, instead of pointing to null, let's point it to this second object, the N1 object. So how do we do that? Let's see if we can work out how to do it. So we go to N and we hit dot, and you have two options. You've got, well, three. You've got get ID, we're not worried about that. Get linked node or set linked node. So set linked node is the one we want because we're going to set the node. And what are we going to give it? What are we going to link it to? Any guesses? N1. Now that line in the code does something very clever to your code. Let's have a look. Let's bring it over here. It has, in that set linked, is taken that linked node member variable from the node class for this N object, and it's actually linked it to the second object. So it's almost like I created a chain, right? So let's do it again. Let's create, in fact, let's not just create, we're going to do this mechanically, but you can obviously see that a loop can do this more efficiently. I'm just going to add a couple more and change their names, and I'm going to create a chain, but I'm going to do it in stages, okay? So let's create node N2, and we create a third node, right? You'll notice in some of the exercises I use an array, and we'll come to using an arrays in a second. For the time being, I'm going to comment that out. So all I have are 4 nodes. Now, what I want to do is I want to run it so you can see what's inside each of these as we go through it. Before I link them, then I'm going to link them. Then you're going to observe, I hope, something quite interesting. So up in the top right corner, I put a breakpoint in here, right? Click on there, which means the code is going to execute and stop at that point. And over here, instead of the play button, I press the debug button, right? So I click that, and down at the bottom it's going to build, it's going to do various different things, and a little window should just pop up in a second. There we go. Right, so let's go to the debugger, and they're not available. What did I do wrong? Am I missing something? I'm not sure I am, but it seems to have just executed and stopped. So I didn't really do what I wanted it to do. So let's have a look. Let's have a quick look. Bear with me a second. I was running the wrong one. I was running something called console test. I didn't even see this. Some of you watching the video might have. I need to debug the exercises class, not console test, whatever that is. So actually what I want to do is get rid of I want to go to edit configurations. I don't want that one, so I can get rid of that, right? The main class is not lecture code, it's not the one I want, it's not the test one I want, it is exercises. That's the main class I want, so I'm going to pop exercises into here, right? Accept that please, thank you very much, say apply, say OK. Over here now you'll notice it's going to execute this file. Now this is a very powerful feature of IntelliJ. It means you can have different main methods. This is your main, your public static main. I don't want to get distracted by this too much, so you know, block your ears for a second if you like, but I'm going to run exercises. That's why it didn't run to this breakpoint. Right, okay, so I've got exercises, the class is exercises, there's my main. Let's go back and click debug exercises. Hopefully some of you spotted my error. So when I hit debug exercises, it puts a lovely blue thick line where my debug is, because the code, I was going to say cold, I don't know why I was going to say cold, has halted at that line. Now the code is live. It's in something called debug mode. It's actually running. If you look down the side here, you'll see there's a stop button, there's resume the program, there's loop back and start again, there's all kinds of stuff, and there are these nice little arrows here. One called step over, which means execute that line of code, and then we'll have a look. There's one called step into, which means go into that line of code. Where does it go? We'll do both. And they're the two crucial ones that we're going to concentrate on. So first of all, what I'm going to do is just execute that line of code, and I do that by stepping over that line. Okay, so I'm in debug mode, I've stepped over. Now have a look at the variables here. Okay, ignore the args, we're not worried about that. Look at this, there's n, and it's got this thing here which says node at 469, right? Pay attention to what that might be, and if I click inside it, the node ID is 0, the linked node is null. Okay, so that's what you would expect, because that's the ID I've just given it. So let's do each of these one at a time and see what they come back with. So to do that, I step over each of the lines where the blue line is. So I'm going to step over that one. I'll stop there and let's have a look. As you see, as we're each of them, the ID for one, the ID value is 1. For the second, for N2, it's 2, which is what I've said in the constructor. So here is a live execution view of the code. Okay, so there are two things to observe. The node ID, which is just an integer, 0, 1, 2, but the linked node is actually, it's got nothing in it. It's null. Right, so now we're going to link stuff up and watch some really interesting things happen. So, happy with that? If you're not happy with that, pause, stop the video, go back and repeat this yourself. Make some notes, make sure you're clear. So as we proceed, I want you to make notes from this video and attempt it yourself to help you understand it. Now, what you might notice also before I just stop here is this and 469 and 470 and 471. Think of these, right, indicating the type of class you've got and the address of that class. That's a concept that will come back to us later, but we'll worry about that later. So hit the stop exercises and let's just change some of the code. Right, so the first thing I wanted to do after I build each of these four is link n, right, that's that one at the top, and I want to link it to N1. Okay, so let's just see what happens if I do that, right? And what we'll do is we'll squeeze it in after we actually create N1. You can't link it if you haven't created it, so we need to create it first, we then link it, right? So shall we see, let's save that, let's see what happens to the values inside. And we're going to take this a step at a time, okay? So I've hit the debug button again at the top. I've arrived at my breakpoint. The code is now live. The dark blue line indicates where it is live. Currently that line hasn't executed. There's nothing down here. So let's step over this line so we execute that line. And we've run that line, so we should have an N value. And if you notice, I'm going to keep this open for you to watch. Now I'm hoping that you'll watch this in HD mode so you can see this, right? Node ID is 0, which was the value again, as I put before, and the link node is null. Right, now I'm going to create N1. So let's execute that line, step over, F8. runs that line, it's created N1. Again, it's pointing to null. Now, for the first one here, I'm going to set the linked node to the second one. Right, so pay attention to what I'm doing. I'm going to link the first one to the second one. So let's run that line of code, step over that. And I don't know if you notice now, let's close down N1 for a second. And look at N, right? So I open up N again, the ID is 0, nothing's changed there, but the linked node is blue and it's pointing to node at 470, which is the same address and location of N1. It's pointing to N1. Let's open it up and see what we see. Under linked node, we see the node ID is 1 because that's the linked node, that's N1, and the linked node, its linked node is null. Does that make sense? Do you follow what I'm doing? Let's create a chain. So what we'll do is we'll make each of them link to the next one and see what happens. Currently, N1 doesn't link to anything, so we'll do the same thing all the way through. N will link. Let's go and get a bit of note so you can see this as an example here, right? So I've got 4 objects: N, N1, N2, and N3. So currently, what I've actually gone and done is that linked node is now pointing to that node, right? I want to do it so I create a chain all the way through so they all link. So from N, I can theoretically go, yeah, next, until I arrive there. Right, so we're going to actually play with this a little bit in a moment by using loops. But you'll see in the exercises that it asks you to make these types of connections and points. Okay, so let's duplicate that concept. So now N1 is going to link to N2, right? So instead of N linking to N1 is going to link to N2, right? And N2 is going to link to N3. And remember, I have to build the object before I can link to it, because if it's not built, it's null. Now, and what I'm going to do at the bottom is I'm going to create a loop. I'm going to create a loop just so I can have a bit of code. There's a really nice way of linking and working our way through this, but what we'll do is we'll go for I equals 0, right? And what we'll do is we'll call this ID just for the sake of simplicity. As long as the ID is less than or equal to, what do we get to, 3, right? We're okay. And semicolon, and ID is just going to jump up one at a time. Okay. Now I didn't want to put, I've made a typo. Can you see it? It's not 4, it should be int. Okay. It's nice to make errors in videos because I like students to sit there and say, you made an error. It's actually quite a good experience for you. Okay, now I'm going to do is I'm going to shift another breakpoint down here, right? I'm not happy with that. Let's shift one there. Oh, not happy with that. That's because I'm running. Hang on, let's stop. There we go. They're happy for me to place one there, because what we're going to do is we are going to create the node, create the next node, link the first to the second, create another node, link the second to the third, create another node, link the third to the fourth. So we're going to do this in steps, and you can see the code and how it works, right? So the image in your mind is this process is what we're going to essentially do, right? Build the first object, build the second object, link to it. Build that object, link to it. Build that object, N3, and link to it. So let's actually have a look at the code doing it. So got a debug point at the beginning so we can step through this. Let's hit the debug button. And now the video is running about 19 minutes now. So please, we're not going to go on for much longer, but I do want you to see this, because if you witness it and visually see it, it'll hopefully make sense for you. Right, so let's step over the first line because we've done that before. Let's step over the second, and let's link the first and the second. So down here, I've created my second object and I've linked to it. So if I open that linked node, it's identical to the second object. You can see from this node at 470. At 470 is its address, a simplified version of its address. Okay, so each of these nodes has a location in memory. The first one is 469, 470, 470. Strictly speaking, they're not addresses because address references are much longer. much more information, but it's like a simplified pointer to that address. Right, so let's create N2, step over that, and down here there's N2, right? Pay attention to what happens to linked node now, because I'm going to link it to N2. Step over, watch it change. And two things have changed, right? I'm going to shift this up, right? And shift the code up a bit as well so you can see. Apologize for the size. Two things have happened, right? First thing to say is I linked N2 to N1. So if we go to N1, the link node is N2, 471, which is this address 471. It's identical, right? It's not a copy, it's identical to N2. Same ID, but the link node is empty because we only created the object. But look at this. Okay, so that's if I go to N1. Let's close those down. Now I'll go back to N. N at the top linked to N1. So the first link node was to, oops, hang on, we're jumping too fast. The first link node was to N1, node ID 1, but it also is now linked to node 2. So its linked node member variable links to node N2. And so from N, we can travel all the way down each of these nodes and get hold of that node. We can move across it. So that's one of the really fascinating things. By chaining them together in this way, you've got incredibly clever mechanisms you can do, right? This is, if you like, the basis of an array, and how an array under the cover works. Now this video is stretched to 21 minutes. What I want to do at this stage is just wrap up this one. So let's just get node N3 built and get a little bit more. There's node N3 built. Let's link 2 to 3 and let's have a look at that very quickly. So there's node 3. It itself is empty, pointing to nothing more. N2 is pointing to N3. Look at the numbers, 472, 472, right? Node 1 is pointing to node 2, which is pointing to node 3. Node N is pointing to node 1, which is pointing to node 2, which you open it up is pointing to node 3. So this is called a linear linked list. It's a list of objects that are linked, and the critical and clever mechanism is what I started this video with. A node class which turns to an object, and inside it the private member variable is of the same type. Now this is what you do with it. This is quite a substantial concept here, and so what I would recommend is you take your time and go back through this and make the code work. Debug it as I have on screen. So you absolutely give it time in your head to sink in, because it's going to form a very big part of how this module and what you're going to build for this module and how the code is going to work. Thank you very much, folks. Now what I would recommend at this stage is now go to the exercises and see if you can make sense of them. Now the first thing you're going to notice just before you go to the first exercise, let's just get the first exercise back, I'll just copy that from there, is that it has an array. An array is just a convenient way of holding each of the nodes, right? But their links inside the node are related to this word here. Do you see that when I create this node, it's linking back to the root? Created that one, it's linking back to the root. It's linking back to the root. So let's just replicate that as code and try to make sense of it for you. So let's go back to our code. Let's make a few adjustments here. Let's go to our exercises. Stop the code. Let's rename N, so you can see the first exercise, what I've done here, and call it root. It will change everything else, okay? So it links it all up. Now, what's interesting is that exercise doesn't link them in that way. So let's get rid of those set linked. It actually uses the constructor. And what it does is when you create node 1, you don't just give it a blank, you give it the object root. You link it backwards. So what is going on there? You give N2 root, it's going backwards. You give it N3 root, it's going backwards. So what on earth is going on here, you might say? It's another way of using this link. So what we have is we have a root node, okay? it's got its node, which is just at the moment pointing to nothing. Okay, so if you look at the code, it's pointing to nothing, right? This line up here at the top. So we're not worried about its one, but we create another node called N1. But this time, the link is back to root. That's what the constructor's doing. We'll check that in a second. We create another node, and the link is back to the root. That's what the second one is doing, and the third one as well. Let's just demonstrate that through running the code. Okay, so again, we're going to debug it. So let's debug it. Give it a second just to get going. Okay, and let's run the first line of code, step over it. It's created our root. So there's our root. Its address is 469. So that's the kind of key that you want to know. So it's at 469. That's the little bit in gray here. So when you run it yourself, its node ID is 0, right? And it's pointing to nothing at the moment. It itself is pointing to nothing. Okay, so we got node 1 constructor, and we're setting the link node. So let's have a look at what we're going to do is just jump into the code and see how that constructor works. So rather than step over at F8, we're going to step into it, which is F7. So let's just go in to F7 to create our node. You'll notice that if I dangle, well, we're now in the node class, so we can trace the code. You see it's passing in N and ID. ID is 1, N is 469, and 469 was the address of the root. So it's handing in the object, which is the root node, okay, to here. So what does it do when it actually gets there? Well, it sets the node ID, it checks that N isn't null, and then it uses linked node and it sets it there in that line there. So off it goes, and that's the constructor. And now we jump back again. So at this point, right, so now what we'll do is we'll just jump over the rest of that line. Okay, so we have created N1. So what do we think is inside when we open up the variable N1? Its address is 470. So down here, its address is at 470. What is this linked node going to point to? It should point to the root, which is at 469. Let's open it up here. Node ID is 1, which is right because it's node 1. Its linked node is 469. And if you open that up, the node ID is 0. It's linked exactly as that image has said. It has linked to this root node here. And essentially, that's what all of them do. So I wonder if this is starting to make sense. Let's have a look at another variation in the exercises. So that's one variation. I want you to have a look. Check that that's right. It should output that, but does it? Okay. Let's have a look at the second one. Right, in the second one, we create an array. We all link them back to the root. But then, no, that's pretty much all we do there as well. We have a slight variation of IDs. So check the IDs, okay. Now this one asks you to actually get to the linked node. So how would I actually output something like this to test that? Now, this is where it gets quite interesting again. So let's go back to the code. So in this example here, all of them are linking back to the root node. Okay, let's stop the code. When I N1, N2, N3. So I haven't put them in an array, so I can't really use a loop. So I want to very, very quickly just create an array to hold them all in. I'm going to do this at the bottom, squeeze the code up a bit here, just so I have a bit more room on screen and you can follow me, right? So here, let's create a nodes array, right, and call it nodes. And there are two ways of doing it. Let's have a look how we've done it on the sheet, so I'll keep it consistent. In the sheet, I just specified how many items we wanted in that array, so let's do the same thing. Right, so I want 3 of them, so I say new node square bracket 3, right? And I've actually made a mistake. I don't know, can you spot it? It doesn't know what nodes is. Why have I got nodes? The name of the class is node. So it's an array of nodes. Easy to make that mistake, but that's how you write it. Okay, so let's take each of those nodes, take the 0, 1, let's point it to the root. Let's take nodes 1, let's point it to, let's point it to N1. Okay, so what we're going to do is each of the nodes we're going to store inside this array so we can loop through them below. I mean, it's kind of fairly, so there's 2 and we're going to store it to, actually we're not storing it, we are actually doing the same thing as linking to it, but don't let that confuse you. That probably just did. I shouldn't have said it. Apologies, folks. Right, so now I have an array. So now I can use this loop to get through the array. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a node. So we'll just say temp, and we're going to extract the node at given that ID. Okay, well, ID now doesn't make sense. It should be index here. Okay, so I'm just going to manually, not refactor, I'm just going to manually change the code. ID mattered when I first typed it. So I give it the index 0. I've got in temp, it's link. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another, and I'm going to say to the temp, get me my link node. Okay, I haven't declared what type of data is, that's why it's gone red. Okay. So now I've got 2. Let's do this. System.out. And all I'm doing is I'm just pulling stuff out from a chain that I've already defined. Okay, so the very first one is current node. So if I can write current, that would help. Current node, space, da-da-dum, and I think it's an ampersand or a plus sign. We'll work it out because I've just been writing some Python code. So excuse me if I kind of concatenate it incorrectly. So that's going to be temp dot get ID. Okay, let's just close that. Let's see if the syntax is happy. Okay, it seemed okay with that. And then actually, let's open it up a bit, right? So if I can hit return on that line there and return on that line, it means I've got a little bit more space. Let's add, put a plus sign there and add, what is it, next node. Okay, this probably is gonna crash, and I wonder if you can see why. This is going to be temp2 get ID. Can you see why this might crash? Anyone? Why might that line of code crash? It's because when I get to the last one, when the current node is this one here, right? Then this one, the next node, the linked node, will be nothing. So it could crash. It might not crash. It all depends what kind of mood it's in and how it handles it. But let's just simply run it because it's better to see it crash or not. Right? Let's have a look and see what it does. Always better to test stuff out. Yeah, it crashed. It wasn't happy with that. Okay, the way to stop it from crashing is just make that go down and not equal 3. Right, so it's 1 less than 3, and let's run it again and let's see what happens. And it crashed again. Right, why did it crash again? Let's have a look at the code. We've got an index. Index is running one at a time. It selects from the nodes that index. So when it's 0, it'll select the very first item. Node 2 takes that temporary value and gets the linked node. So in theory, 1, 2, 3 should be okay. Then it has a system out print line, which is linked in that way. I suspect the problem is probably here. So I'm just going to shift this into here and see if we can debug it. Okay, this is a skill that's actually quite critical for you folks. Even if you think, no, I'm here to write and learn how to write code. No, you're here to also learn how to think about programming and work it out. Let's run it and see what happens. I like to see an error, and if an error crashes, it's crashing at 18. Oh, it's crashing up there. Oh, the problem is different. I didn't even pay attention to the error. It's because I've said 3 when I should have said 4, right? Which means that I go 0, 1, 2, 3. So as long as the index is less than or equal to 3, we're okay. No, it's not. It's still going to crash. Let's just make it less than. Play around with it. It's always fun to actually see it work or not. Right, let's run it now and see what happens. And it crashed at 27. And it crashed at 27 because the next ID, the link, isn't so good. Right, so there is a better loop. There is a much better loop, and I'm going to cheat and I'm going to use the other loop. Right, so it's called, you do it like this. colon, and I just say nodes here. So what I'm going to do, and I don't need to do this anymore, I don't need the index value. Can you see what I've done there? This is a different type of loop. It'll actually iterate through each value. This line is clearly going to crash, right? So you really want to try catch around there. So what you can do is you can do two ways. You can do a try catch, or you can say if temp get linked node, right, which is could be, as long as it isn't null, then just go ahead and execute that line of code. Otherwise it shouldn't. Okay, we also need to declare that outside of that if statement. So let's pop it up here. Whoops, pop it up here. No, let's pop it up here. Right, so we go node temp 2. So hopefully you're still following what I'm up to here, and I'm live coding while we are chatting. We don't need to declare it there because that's just an error. Fingers crossed that's okay. No, still not happy with it. What's the problem with temp2 over here? Get ID. Is it going to actually tell me what the issue is? Here we go. The issue is temp2. So it can't see this node 2. So let's take it outside of the loop and pop it here. Okay, give me a sec and pop it there. So everything inside can see it. Now, why are you not happy? It's probably something really dumb and really obvious. Temp2 get ID next node. Bear with me a second. Sometimes you get these kind of simpler errors. That gets the ID from temp2. Variable temp2 might not have been initialized. Okay, all right. So I'm just going to give it a null value, okay, just to satisfy IntelliJ. IntelliJ is complaining because I created an object and I hadn't initialized it. I'm just going to give it a null. Okay, let's see whether this actually works. And at line 27, it still has a problem. Current node, temp ID. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that out and spot where my obvious error is. Temp2 get ID. So can anyone spot where the issue is? What I would recommend is you code this yourself, you fix this particular problem, and because this video is going on rather too long and I don't want to spend ages more just fixing it. Spot where the issue is, but at this point, hopefully it does make sense to you of what I'm trying to do.